Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 144 and it's titled How Many Lords is Too Many Lords? And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So getting into our random card of the week, there is of course a ton of suggested cards on this channel. If you would like to make sure that your card that you suggest is guaranteed to be turned into a video, do check us out on Patreon, like Tyler Esme here did. And this week, though, we have a bit of a unique random card, because you may notice it actually says cards plural, and in this case we have a trio of cards that we're kind of going to be turning into just one deck. So when I first started talking to Tyler about this, it really seemed like the Scion of the Ur-Dragon and the World Tree were going to be two very different decks. And then we kind of came to the conclusion that both of them worked well with Maskwood Nexus, and so it kind of just became a way to figure out how we could make all three of these cards work together. The nice thing is, Scion of the Ur-Dragon, which is a white, blue, black, red, green for a 4/4 dragon avatar, it's got flying. Pay 2, search your library for a dragon permanent card, put it into your graveyard. If you do, Scion of the Ur-Dragon becomes a copy of that card until the end of turn, then shuffle your library. So Scion is, of course, going to be our commander. We'll talk about that in just a second. But it's important to note that we are a 5-color deck, and our commander cares about dragons. The World Tree, though, enters the battlefield tapped. It's a land. Taps for a green mana. As long as you control 6 or more lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. Then you can pay 2 of every color, tap it and sacrifice it to search your library for any number of god cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. If you notice, up front these two don't really synergize that well together because Scion cares about dragons and the World Tree cares about gods. However, once we put Maskwood Nexus into play, every single creature in our entire deck is both a dragon and a god, plus whatever other creature types we may need. Because Maskwood Nexus is 4 mana for an artifact, creatures you control are every creature type. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. Then it also has the ability to pay 3 and tap it to make a 2/2 blue shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. So, as I've already mentioned, our commander is Scion of the Ur-Dragon, so I wanted to make sure that we were building a little bit around the commander, but because we're very heavily focused on Maskwood Nexus, we're not actually running that many dragons. We're focused more on being able to get pretty much any creature card out of our deck because we're going to have Maskwood Nexus in play. Then if we ever get lucky enough to trigger the World Tree and activate its ability to put every god into play, that also winds up being every single creature in our deck. So that is where most of what we're trying to do is coming from. Now, with all of that being said, obviously we need to have some themes that tie this deck together. We can't just hope to draw Maskwood Nexus and then play the World Tree and immediately combo off. That's probably not going to happen. So instead, we're playing a ton of Lord effects. And so Lord is the idea that it's giving a creature type specifically +1/+1. A good example of that is Gallia of the Endless Dance, which is red and a green for a 2/2 legendary creature, Satyr. She has haste. Other satyrs you control get +1/+1 and have haste, and whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you may discard a card at random. If you do, draw 2 cards. This is really what we wanted to focus on with this deck, because if we start playing a bunch of Lord effects, things that give +1/+1, that's pretty good, but I also wanted to focus specifically on the Lord effects that do something else. Gallia, for example, gives +1/+1, but she also gives haste. And that can be incredibly powerful when we're talking about big creatures like Scion of the Ur-Dragon and maybe some other stuff that we'll get into a little bit later. So that is theme number 1. We, of course, got to be buffing up all of our creatures, no matter what creature type they are. And then our second theme is because we have all of our creatures being the same creature type, it only makes sense that we can then name a specific creature type to get some sort of bonus. So for example, we have Distant Melody, which is 3 and a blue for a sorcery. Choose a creature type, draw a card for each permanent you control of that type. Normally, you would play this in a deck that has all wizards or all satyrs. But because we actually don't really have a unifying creature type, it doesn't make a lot of sense that it would be in here until you remember that Maskwood Nexus makes all of our creatures all creature types. So if we have 5 creatures in play, even though they might be printed with different creature types, we could just say something like squirrel and then draw 5 cards because every single one of our creatures is a squirrel. So Distant Melody puts in a ton of work to draw us a bunch of cards, but there's a bunch of other cards that also say choose a creature type and then do something related to that creature type, which ideally with this deck is going to be every single creature we have in play. Now, all of this sounds great, but if we don't have Maskwood Nexus, this plan kind of falls apart. So that is where theme number 3 comes in, which is finding the Maskwood Nexus. We need to make sure we have it at any given point, and so we are going to be using Fabricate and other cards like it to make sure we always have access to it. And Fabricate is just 2 and a blue for a sorcery, search your library for an artifact card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Just a simple, efficient tutor is something that's going to be very valuable in this deck because, again, we need to make sure we have Maskwood Nexus. If we don't, the whole plan kind of falls apart. And so, because of that, we also have a lot of other ways built into the deck to make sure that we can re-buy Maskwood Nexus just in case something happens to it. We've got ways to get it out of our graveyard, ways to get it out of our library. We even have a couple of ways to get it out of exile. So we really went pretty deep on making sure that we could protect Maskwood Nexus because it truly is the linchpin of the entire deck. Now, with all of that being said, we do of course have some other key cards that I would like to talk about. Obviously, Maskwood Nexus is like top tier, the only S plus, whatever it may be, card in the entire deck. But there are other phenomenal support cards that help the deck to shine. And the first of those that I want to talk about is Aura Skyclave Hierophant. Aura is 2 white-black for a 3/3 core cleric. He has lifelink, and whenever Aura or another creature you control dies, return target cleric card with lesser converted mana cost from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is immensely powerful when you think about the fact that all of our creatures are now clerics. With Maskwood Nexus, this essentially means that any board wipe allows us to get back at least one other creature for each creature that dies, because as soon as a creature dies, it can target another creature that's in the graveyard if it died at the same time as that creature. So if Aura dies, we can get back a 3-mana spell, but if Aura dies and another 3-mana spell dies, we can get back a different 3-mana spell, we can get back the same 3-mana spell, plus we can also get a 2-mana spell. So Aura is phenomenal board wipe protection, but is also a great way to just kind of keep accruing some sort of value. So I think because of that, Aura definitely deserves a spot in our key cards list here. And honestly, I think it kind of overperforms just in general, both in this deck and outside of it. So if you've never played against Aura, it can put in a lot of work. Now, moving on to our next key card, we have Grist the Hunger Tide. One of the very few planeswalkers, in fact, I believe the only planeswalker, that also counts as a creature, more specifically an insect creature, which means that when it's not on the battlefield, it is a creature and can therefore still be triggered by Maskwood Nexus, turning it into any other creature type. So if we have something that says it cares about a permanent that is a creature type, we can use it to get Grist out of our deck, we can use it to return it from our graveyard, we can do some kind of weird shenanigans with this card that you wouldn't think would be possible because it's a planeswalker, but because it's also an insect creature, it kind of gets around some stuff. But that's a lot to say. It's a very powerful card, and of course we should probably read the card to make sure we know what it does. So Grist the Hunger Tide is 1 black-green for a 3 loyalty legendary planeswalker Grist. As long as Grist isn't on the battlefield, it's a 1/1 insect creature in addition to its other types. +1, create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token, then mill a card. If an insect card was milled this way, put a loyalty counter on Grist and repeat this process. -2, you may sacrifice a creature. When you do, destroy target creature or planeswalker. -5, each opponent loses life equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Grist even with just his +1 ability, is very powerful in the deck because it's not that we're playing an insect deck, but because of Maskwood Nexus, every creature counts as an insect, so we could +1 to make an insect, mill over something like Aura, which then counts as an insect, and we do it again, put a loyalty counter, mill another card, and it can get out of hand very quickly if we have a pocket of creatures on top of our deck, and then with things like Aura, if stuff dies, we can just get it back. So Grist is a very powerful value engine and definitely worth a slot in our key cards, even though it looks a little bit weird from the outside. Now, finally though, that leads us to our last key card, which is going to be Haunted One. And this one is very unique in the sense that it does need our commander, which isn't always ideal given how expensive our commander is and how mana intensive it is. But Haunted One is 2 and a black for a legendary enchantment background. So commander creatures you own have, whenever this creature becomes tapped, it and other creatures you control that share a creature type with it get +2/+0 and gain Undying until the end of turn. So that means that if it dies, if it has no +1/+1 counters on it, it comes back to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. This again isn't necessarily board wipe protection because we can't use it on our opponent's turn, but it's definitely protection in the sense that we can swing out with our entire board and everything is going to get +2/+0 and Undying. So if it dies in combat, we don't really care. It's just going to come right back into play. And because of Maskwood Nexus, everything is a dragon, everything is an insect, everything is a cleric. So everything shares a creature type with the Dragon, or the Scion of the Dragon, I suppose I should say, since those are 2 different cards. And so that's going to make Haunted One very, very powerful as essentially just a repeatable Anthem effect with that +2/+0, but also the protection from Undying. So Haunted One definitely also earns its spot here in the key cards. I think all of these cards are very impressive, and if I'm being perfectly honest, it was actually very difficult to pick 3 key cards for this deck because everything does something unique and everything does something very powerful. So any of these could have been replaced with something else and I would have been happy with it. So let me know down in the comments what you think the key cards of this deck might be. I'd be interested to know if you might pick something else to kind of replace the top 3 slots. But like I said, let me know, and we'll move on to the next piece of our deck tech, which is going to be the cool interactions. These are the cards that synergize very well together, and while they may not necessarily always win the game, they at least create some sort of value engine that pushes us toward a victory. The first cool interaction that I want to highlight is one that's actually very powerful and a lot of fun, for, at least in my own personal opinion, and that is Magda Brazen Outlaw and Mana Weft Sliver. So Magda is 1 and a red for a 2/1 Dwarf Berserker. Other dwarves you control get +1/+0. Whenever a dwarf you control becomes tapped, create a treasure token, and sacrifice 5 treasures, search your library for an artifact or dragon card, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. And Mana Weft Sliver is 1 and a green for a 1/1 Sliver. Sliver creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. Now, just looking at these 2 cards, there's actually 3 different relevant creature types printed on these cards. Magda cares about dwarves, Mana Weft Sliver cares about slivers, and Magda can tutor up dragon cards directly to the battlefield. With these 2 combined, all of our creatures become mana dorks, provided, once again, we have Maskwood Nexus. We're pretty much assuming that we always have Maskwood Nexus, so we would be able to tap all of our creatures, because they all tap for mana, because they're all slivers, and then every creature we tap then also creates a treasure token. And that can get out of hand very quickly, because if we have 5 creatures, we tap them for 5 treasures, we make 5 mana, we then have access to 10 mana if we really want it, or we just made 5 treasures, we can sacrifice them to Magda and search our library for a dragon, which is, because of Maskwood Nexus, any creature in our entire deck, and put it into play. That is immensely powerful and can get out of hand very, very quickly, especially when you consider the fact that both of these cards are 2 mana. We could get this in play as early as turn 3 and really start valuing out the rest of the table. So Magda and Mana Weft Sliver are a very powerful combination, and one that I am a big fan of, even though it probably won't be a big hit at the tables depending on how quickly you can get the engine rolling. But that is only cool interaction number 1. We, of course, have one more interaction, and this one is going to be between Drogskull Captain and Knight Exemplar. If we are looking to protect our board, there's no better way to do it than with these two cards. Drogskull Captain is 1 white-blue for a 2/2 Spirit Soldier. It's got flying. Other spirit creatures you control get +1/+1 and have hexproof. Knight Exemplar is 1 white-white for a 2/2 Human Knight with First Strike. Other knight creatures you control get +1/+1 and are indestructible. Being able to have both of these in play at the same time means that our entire board is both hexproof and indestructible. Now, the only exception to this is going to be these two cards in particular, since Drogskull Captain cannot give itself hexproof and Knight Exemplar cannot give itself indestructible. So if someone goes to target something, they could remove the Captain, or if someone board wipes, they could remove the Exemplar. But being able to protect the rest of our board is very powerful. And if we have some way to maybe give the Drogskull Captain hexproof with like Swiftfoot Boots or something like that, then we could possibly have a better board state, or at least a better form of protection for our board state. But that's not necessarily the goal here. The goal is to make sure that cards like Magda, like Manawef Sliver, like the Scion of the Ur Dragon are all hexproof and indestructible, because then our opponents are forced to use 2 separate removal spells to get through what's happening. They've got to get rid of indestructibility, and they've got to get rid of hexproof if they want to destroy some of our creatures, which means that they have to waste 2 removal spells on these creatures before they can go after our big ones. And if we're being honest, if our opponents have 3 removal spells to waste just to kill our commander or something, then we're probably winning anyway, because that's a lot of removal that was just used probably for not that much gain, considering we're going to be just kind of pumping out creatures for the majority of the game. So that is the last of our cool interactions, and the last piece of this deck tech that of course we got to get to is the price of the deck. Normally our budget is $100 and we kind of can float around there, but this week we got about $86.93, which, if I'm being honest, is a lot lower than I thought it was going to be when I first started building it. I thought we'd wind up in the mid to high 90s, but being 86, not terrible. And the reason we're at $86, though, is because we have a couple of very expensive cards in the deck, one in particular being the Titan of Littjara. And yes, I know, this is the second week in a row that the Titan of Littjara has shown up as the most expensive card in the entire deck, but I think that just goes to show its power in the sense that I really want to include it in as many decks that care about creature types as possible, because it really is just that good. So Titan of Littjara, even though it's a massive $8.49, is 4 blue for a 6/6 illusion. As Titan of Littjara enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. As a reminder, we do not care what creature type we pick because our creatures are all creature types. Titan of Littjara is the chosen type in addition to its other types, and whenever the Titan of Littjara enters the battlefield or attacks, you may draw a card for each other creature you control that shares a creature type with it. If you do, discard a card. So I'm going to keep using 5 because it's a nice easy number for me. If we have 5 other creatures in play, we cast Titan, we then draw 5 cards, discard a card, and then when it goes to attack, we draw 5 more, we discard another card. That has let us look at 10 cards off the top of our deck, and yeah, we've had to discard 2, but we still got to keep 8 of them in our hand. That is a very, very powerful card draw engine, and one that, with a lot of our protection pieces, isn't probably going to go anywhere anytime soon. There's going to be a lot of times where we have something like the Drogskull Captain to give it hexproof, or we have the Knight Exemplar to give it indestructible. We have a lot of ways to make sure that the Titan is protected, and also, honestly, could have haste. We talked a little bit about Gallia earlier, could give haste. So this is a great way to keep refilling our hand and keep presenting a threat to the table. So I do think it's worth the inclusion in the deck, which again obviously is why I've included it as the most expensive card 2 weeks in a row. But if you do need to cut it, it would trim the price of the deck down to about $78, which is a little bit more manageable. Still not super cheap, but it's at least a little bit better. So with that being said, though, if you want to increase the price of this deck or have just maybe a little bit of a power boost, I have a suggestion for an out-of-budget upgrade that I think would go very well in this deck. and a card that I would take out if you decided to slot that card in. So this week, the out-of-budget upgrade that I would suggest is going to be Roaming Throne. And I'm sure those of you that have been paying attention to a lot of the Commander discussions online have heard of Roaming Throne. It's pretty impressive in pretty much any deck that it shows up in. It is 4 mana for a 4/4 Golem. It has Ward 2. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Roaming Throne is the chosen type in addition to its other types, and if a triggered ability of another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time. Since there's a lot of abilities in this deck, being able to double up on pretty much anything that's happening is incredibly powerful, and that's stuff like the Titan of Letjara, which triggers from entering the battlefield or attacking, meaning that instead of drawing 5 cards and discarding 1 card, we're now drawing 10 cards and discarding 2. That is very fast, very efficient, and definitely something to pay attention to. Now, the downside to that is that it is $12.45, so it is out of our budget, but if you did want to include it and you needed a card to take out, a card I would suggest taking out is Mistform Warchief. And Mistform Warchief is 2 and a blue for an illusion. It's a 1/3. Creature spells you play that share a creature type with Mistform Warchief cost 1 less to play. And tap, Mistform Warchief's type becomes the creature type of your choice until the end of turn. This is technically just a ramp spell in the sense that once we have Maskwood Nexus, all of our creatures are going to cost 1 less to play. And while that's very powerful, I think doubling up on abilities is actually even more powerful because we have quite a bit of mana generation in the deck. We have things like the Mana Weft Sliver. We have a couple of gate synergies because we are a 5-color deck and gates are a very cheap mana base. So we have the ways to make the mana. We don't necessarily have the ways to benefit from the triggers in the same way that Roaming Throne would let us. So I do think it is an upgrade to the deck, but the deck does run perfectly fine without it. If you want to include Mistform Warchief and keep the budget restriction, that is something that you can do as well. But overall, that is our deck for this week. And before we get into the game, because of course we gotta see how this deck performs in a game to get a real sense of how it works, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support us if that's something you're interested in doing. As always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That really does help out a lot, and I very much appreciate it. But if you want to find us on any of the other social media accounts, you can find us on Twitter, Reddit, send us an email. And if you want to support the channel a little bit more directly, you can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and you can support us as a channel member right here on YouTube, where you get a ton of amazing benefits, like joining a Discord where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games. You get the unedited gameplay videos, you get a card sent to you every single month, you get the access to a deck list a week early, and you get the guarantee from me that any of your suggestions will be turned into videos eventually. So if you would like to join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard, then check us out on Patreon or right here on YouTube. But with all of that being said, let's actually see what we're going to do with this game and test out how our deck works. So this week, we're going to be joined by 3 opponents. We have Bilal playing the Master Multiplied, we have Luke playing Ziatora the Incinerator, and we have Josh playing the Council of 4. So starting off with Bilal, the Master Multiplied, this is a deck that I have not played against before, so I'm very interested to see how it goes. But essentially, he doesn't really care about the Myriad rule because of his commander. So his commander can attack, make copies of itself, then on his next turn, those copies stick around, he can then do it again and again and again, and it kind of just gets out of hand exponentially. So I'm not quite sure what he's doing with this one, but I am very excited to see what it's going to look like. Next up, we have Luke, who I believe said is actually playing his brother's deck today, and this is a Phoenix deck. So he is playing Ziatora the Incinerator, but it's actually full of Phoenixes because Ziatora can sacrifice the Phoenix to put them into the graveyard and then get them back, but also do damage and make treasures. So it seems like a very cool idea, and I'm very excited to see it. We just played a Ziatora Skeletons deck a little while back, so apparently Ziatora is just the go-to Jund commander for odd creature types, so I am excited to see that. And then last but not least, we have Josh, appearing in his second game on the channel, where he is playing the Council of Four. And from what he said, this is kind of a group hug deck. He wants to make sure that everybody's drawing a ton of cards and casting a ton of spells, because then he's able to draw more cards and make some tokens and eventually just run people over with some knights. So I'm very excited for this. Council of Four is a commander that I've had my eye on for a little bit. It seems a little bit too control-y for my liking, but I'm very interested to see what Josh does with it, and who knows, maybe it'll give me some inspiration to work on a deck of my own. So let me know down in the comments which of these commanders you think might be the toughest for us to face. But without any further ado, let's jump into this game, see how we do, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by myself, Luke, and then Josh. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a Swamp. I play an Orzhov Guildgate. Luke plays a Riveteer's Outlook, which sacrifices itself, gains Luke a life, and lets him search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Josh plays a Port Town, tapped. Bilal plays a Dragonskull Summit and casts Throne of the God Pharaoh, making each opponent lose a life in his end step for each tapped creature he controls. I play a Gateway Plaza, paying a mana when it enters so that I don't have to sacrifice it. Luke casts a Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards, then plays a Gruul Turf, returning a mountain to his hand. Josh plays a Sea of Clouds, then casts Prince Imrahil the Fair, letting him make a 1/1 human token whenever he draws his second card each turn. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts Fleshbag Marauder, making each player sacrifice a creature, killing itself and Prince Imrahil. I play a Simic Guildgate. Luke plays a Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Josh plays a Plains and casts Decanter of Endless Water, gaining no maximum hand size. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts Solemn Simulacrum, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. I play a Forest and cast Ferris Band Warchief, giving my other Centaur creatures +1/+1, Vigilance, and Trample. Luke plays a Swamp and casts Cyrix Carrier of the Flame, so that in his end step, if a Phoenix left his graveyard this turn, target Phoenix does damage equal to its power to any target. He then moves to combat and attacks Josh for 3 with Cyrix since it has haste. Josh plays a Windbrisk Heights, hiding away a card, then casts Quain Itinerant Meddler, which can tap to allow each player to draw a card and gain a life. Bilal plays a Mountain and casts Dragonlord Kolagan, giving all his creatures haste. He then moves to combat and attacks me for 2 with Solemn Simulacrum, then at the end of his turn, all of Bilal's opponents lose a life from Throne of the God Pharaoh, since he has 1 tapped creature. I play a Boros Guildgate and cast Min Wily Illusionist, letting me make a 1/1 illusion token that gets +1/+0 for each other illusion I control whenever I draw my second card each turn. Then, whenever an illusion I control dies, I can put a permanent from my hand with mana value less than or equal to the illusion's power into play. In response, Josh casts Vision Skeins, letting each player draw 2 cards. Once that resolves, I move to combat and attack Luke for 3 with the Warchief. Luke plays a Mountain and casts Gruul Signet, then attacks me for 3 with Cyrix. In his second main phase, Luke activates Skargan Firebird's ability from the graveyard to return to play with 3 +1/+1 counters thanks to Bloodthirst. Unfortunately, the ability puts it into his hand, not into play, but we don't catch that during this game. Then, in his end step, since a Phoenix left his graveyard, he has the Firebird do 6 damage to Min, killing her. On Josh's turn, he plays a Reliquary Tower, once again gaining no maximum hand size, then cast Anvil of Bogarden, letting each player draw an additional card when they draw for turn, but then also discard a card. Bilal draws an additional card for his turn, and notably discards Anger, giving all his creatures haste while it's in the graveyard, and he controls a mountain, which he does. He then casts Thaumatic Compass, letting him pay 3 mana to search his library for a basic land, put it into his hand, then transforming it if he controls 7 or more lands in his end step. He also casts Rising of the Day, giving his creatures haste and his legendary creatures +1/+0. He then attacks me for 2 with Solemn Simulacrum, and this time I block it, killing it, letting Bilal draw a card. In his second main phase, he casts Swiftfoot Boots. Then, at the end of turn, Thaumatic Compass transforms into Spires of Orazca. At the start of my turn, I draw an additional card and discard 1, then I play a mountain, foretell a card, and also cast Coveted Prize, searching my library for a card and putting it into my hand. On Luke's turn, he draws an additional card and discards a card, then plays a mountain and casts his commander Ziatora the Incinerator, letting him sacrifice a creature in his end step to make 3 treasures and do damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to any target. He moves to combat, attacking Josh for 3 with Cyrex and Bilal for 6 with the Firebird. Josh takes the 3 damage, but before damage, Bilal activates Spires of Orazca, tapping it to untap the Firebird and remove it from combat. In his end step, Luke pays 3 mana to return Lightning Phoenix from his graveyard to play since an opponent lost 3 or more life this turn. Then he also sacrifices the Skargan Firebird to Ziatora, doing 6 damage to Kolagon, killing it and making 3 treasures. Also in the end step, Josh activates Quain, tapping it so that each player can draw a card and gain a life. In response, Luke activates Skargan Firebird, once again returning it to play with 3 +1/+1 counters. On Josh's turn, he draws an additional card and discards a card, then casts Ghostly Prison, making each opponent pay 2 mana for each creature attacking him. Bilal draws an additional card and discards a card, plays a mountain, and casts his commander the Master Multiplied, which has Myriad, prevents the legend rule from applying to his creature tokens, and prevents him from sacrificing or exiling creature tokens to triggered abilities. When it enters, he equips him with Swiftfoot Boots, giving him hexproof and haste, but in response, Josh casts Oblation, shuffling the Master into Bilal's library and drawing him 2 cards instead. On my turn, I draw an additional card and discard a card, play a Buried Ruin, then cast Knight Exemplar, giving my other knights +1/+1 and indestructible. I also cast Maskwood Nexus, giving all my creatures all creature types. After that, I move to combat and attack Bilal for 4 with the War Chief. Luke draws an additional card and discards a card, then plays a Swamp, and moves to combat, attacking me for 6 with the Firebird and Bilal for 2 with the Lightning Phoenix. When he declares attacks, he pays 3 mana to return Nemesis Phoenix from his graveyard to the battlefield, tapped and attacking Josh for 4, since he attacked 2 or more opponents. In his second main phase, he casts Solfim Mayhem Dominus, doubling the non-combat damage that he would deal. Then, in his end step, Cyrex triggers, having Skargan Firebird do 6 damage to Bilal, which is doubled to 12. And Ziatora sacrifices the Firebird, doing 2 damage to Knight Exemplar, doubling it to 4, killing it while Luke makes 3 treasures. Still at the end of turn, Josh activates Quain, letting each player draw a card and gain a life. On Josh's turn, he draws an additional card and discards a card. Then he casts Soul Ring, followed up by casting Arcane Signet. Finally, he casts Council's Judgment, making each player vote for a non-land permanent that Josh doesn't control, exiling each permanent tied for the most votes. This has Josh and Bilal voting for Solfim, while Luke and I vote for Throne of the God Pharaoh, exiling both of them. Bilal draws an additional card and discards 1, plays a Swamp, and recasts his commander, the Master Multiplied, but unfortunately for Bilal, Josh once again has an answer, countering it with Counterspell. Once that resolves, Bilal casts Legion Loyalist and passes. On my turn, I draw an additional card and discard 1, Then I play the World Tree, letting my lands tap for mana of any color, and I cast General Kudro, giving my other humans +1/+1, and exiling a card from a graveyard whenever it or another human enters under my control, this time exiling Skargan Firebird from Luke's graveyard. I also cast Catilda Dawnheart Prime, letting my humans tap for a mana of any color, and exiling Faithless Looting from Luke's graveyard when she enters. I move to combat, attacking Bilal for 4 with the War Chief, and in my second main phase, I cast Drogskull Captain, giving my other spirits +1/+1 and hexproof, and also exiling Anger from Bilal's graveyard. Luke draws an additional card and discards a card, plays a swamp, and casts Flame Wreathed Phoenix with Bilal paying the tribute so that it enters with an additional 2 +1/+1 counters. After that, he attacks me for 6 with Ziatora, and, in his second main phase, casts a Pirate's Pillage, discarding a card, drawing 2 cards, and making 2 treasures. Once that's resolved, he casts Shard Phoenix, which can sacrifice itself to do 2 damage to each creature without flying, then Luke can spend 3 mana to return it from his graveyard to his hand in his upkeep. When he moves to his end step, Luke sacrifices the Flame Wreathed Phoenix to Ziatora, making 3 treasures and doing 5 damage to Josh. Still at the end of turn, Josh activates Quain, letting each player draw a card and gain a life. Josh draws an additional card and discards a card, plays an island, and then casts his commander, the Council of 4, letting Josh draw a card whenever a player draws their second card on their turn, and also make a 2/2 Knight token whenever a player casts their second spell on their turn. He also casts Iron Maiden, doing damage to an opponent in their upkeep equal to the number of cards in their hand more than 4. Since this is also his second spell for the turn, he creates a Knight token. At the start of Bilal's turn, he takes 4 damage since he has 8 cards in hand, draws 2, then discards 1. This triggers the Council of 4, letting Josh also draw a card. Then he plays a mountain and casts Godo Bandit Warlord, searching his library for an equipment, in this case Helm of the Host, putting it into play. Then he's able to equip Godo with the helm, creating a non-legendary token copy of it at the beginning of combat. Notably, Godo also allows Bilal to untap all his samurai and get an extra combat step whenever Godo attacks for the first time each turn. With this combo, Bilal is able to create a copy of Godo, attack with it, get an extra combat, and repeat the process an infinite number of times. This allows him to knock Luke and I both out of the game immediately, but because of Josh's Ghostly Prison, he's unable to attack Josh this turn. Josh, though, not seeing a way to fight through the infinite number of Godo tokens, decides to concede as well, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a very abrupt ending, which I think isn't ideal for our deck. I think we were just starting to get rolling, but I think we did show some of the power of what we could do. Being able to drop the Knight Exemplar and make our opponents deal with it, or the Drogskull Captain and make our opponents deal with it. Being able to have Vigilance and Trample and Centaurs and all of that nonsense was very, very fun for me. I really enjoyed having all of the different creature types kind of laid out and pumping each other up. I thought it was a ton of fun. So I would love to see this deck get another shot, maybe at some point in the future, but let me know down in the comments what you thought, if you think that there are any improvements we could make, if you think there's any cards that maybe should get cut. But overall, like I said, I'm pretty proud of this deck. I think it did pretty good. Moving around the table in turn order from where we sat, we have Luke, who played his Phoenix deck. And unfortunately, there were a couple of misplays in there, like the Skargan Firebird returning to play, which I think didn't really make a difference in the end, but it is worth noting that Phoenix, while very strong, are kind of a weird group of creatures because they all come back from the graveyard in different ways. It's kind of the running joke that a Phoenix from a set will have like the set mechanic, and that's how it comes back from the graveyard, so it's a little difficult to build around them, but I do think Ziatora was actually the right commander choice there. I think it worked very well, and I think that Luke definitely presented himself as a threat for most of the game, which, as bad as it sounds, is not something you would normally say about the Phoenix deck at the table, so very, very sweet deck. And then next up, Josh also almost able to kind of close out a victory on his own. He set up quite the protection with Ghostly Prison and helped people draw cards with Quain and was starting to run a little wild with the Council of Four. And I think that if he'd had maybe just one or two more turns, it probably would have been Josh's game. But unfortunately, it wasn't to be, as of course Bilal was able to kind of bait out some counterspells and removal. I'm not sure if that was his intention, but it definitely worked out that way, where running his commander out a couple of times meant that Josh had already used a removal spell, had already used a counterspell, and then didn't have any interaction for when Bilal dropped the Godo Helm combo into play. So very, very cool. And I know that there's always a little bit of aversion to an infinite combo kind of out of nowhere, but considering Godo Helm is an 11 mana combo, I think it's pretty okay to just say, he got there, and unfortunately, there wasn't much that Josh was going to be able to do. He did have the Ghostly Prison, so he couldn't be knocked out by Bilal on that first turn, but he also realized that it was just kind of going to keep happening. Bilal was just going to keep chipping in for damage and keep getting through, and Josh's deck wasn't really built for the long game against a single player, so it wasn't going to end in his favor, so he decided to just concede, which I do think is the right choice in the moment. So a very cool showing by everybody's decks. I hopefully will get to see the Master Multiplied show up again, because I would love to actually see the Master, show up on the board or attack. I think that would be kind of cool to see the exponential gain of all these tokens. But overall, let me know down in the comments what you thought of the game. Let me know what you thought of the deck. And thank you all so much for watching and for hopefully enjoying the game as much as I did. But other than that, I will talk to you all soon, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.